All right, everybody, welcome back. Ready to untangle another complex topic. This time, we're diving into something that can feel like a bit of a black box for a lot of folks, the economy.
Ah, yes, the economy. Sounds intimidating, right?
It can be.
Yeah.
I mean, you hear all this jargon, GDP, inflation, interest rates, and it's easy to feel lost. But trust me, at its core, the economy is a pretty straightforward machine.
A machine, huh?
Exactly. And just like any machine, it has a few key parts that work together in a specific way. And once you understand those parts, the whole thing starts to make a lot more sense. That's what we're going to do today, take this economic machine apart and see how it ticks.
I like that. Taking it apart piece by piece.
Yep. No fancy theories, no complicated equations, just a clear look at the mechanics. And lucky for us, we've got our economics expert here to guide us through this dissection.
Well, I wouldn't call myself a mechanic, but I can definitely help explain things.
You're definitely our go-to for breaking down complex economic stuff. So let's start with the basics. What's the most fundamental element of this economic machine we're talking about?
Hmm. Well, I'd say it all boils down to transactions.
Transactions,
Yeah.
like buying groceries, paying rent.
Exactly. Every time you buy something, get a service, or even invest in something, you're engaging in a transaction. It's basically an exchange of value between a buyer and a seller.
Okay, so those everyday actions are actually tiny parts of this giant economic machine.
Precisely. Think of it this way. Each transaction is like a tiny gear. And when millions of these gears are turning, they generate this powerful engine that drives economic activity.
I'm starting to see the picture. But what exactly is fueling this economic engine? What makes those gears turn?
That, my friend, is the magic of credit.
Credit, I'll admit that word always makes me a little nervous. It's powerful, but can also be a bit dangerous, right?
Right, you have to be careful with it. But at its core, credit lets us do things we couldn't do otherwise. Think about it. Most people can't buy a house or start a business without borrowing money.
That's true. But how does credit, these individual loans and stuff, impact the entire economy?
Well, it kind of acts like an accelerator. It lets us spend more than we're currently earning, and that extra spending fuels economic growth. But this also leads to those cyclical patterns of booms and busts that we see throughout history.
Ah, so credit is both the gas pedal and the potential for a wild ride. Okay, this is starting to make sense.
Precisely. And to understand these cycles, we need to look at them from two perspectives, the short-term debt cycle and the long-term debt cycle.
Okay, let's start with the short-term cycle. How does that work?
Well, imagine a time when the economy is doing really well. People are feeling optimistic. They're more likely to borrow money to buy things, invest in businesses. The good times are rolling. And all this spending fuels even more economic growth.
Sounds like a party. But I have a
Yeah.
feeling this party can't last forever, can it?
You're right. As borrowing and spending increase, we start to see that classic supply and demand thing happening. More money chasing the same amount of goods and services leads to.
Rising prices. Inflation, right?
Exactly. And when inflation gets out of control, central banks like the Federal Reserve in the US step in to try to cool things down.
How do they do that?
Their main tool is interest rates.
Oh, interest rates, right. So they raise those rates to make borrowing more expensive and slow down spending.
Precisely. Higher interest rates encourage people to save more and borrow less. Businesses also tighten their belts, spending slows down, and the economy starts to cool off.
And if it cools off too much, we can dip into a recession.
That's one possible outcome, yes. Recessions are a natural part of this cycle driven by credit.
Okay, so it's this constant back and forth, a bit of a tug of war between expansion and contraction.
You got it.
But you mentioned a long-term debt cycle too, right? How does
Yeah.
that fit into the picture?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. The long-term debt cycle is all about the cumulative effect of those short-term cycles,
Meaning,
meaning that even though the economy goes through these ups and downs, debt often keeps piling up over the long term.
oh, I see. We keep kicking the can down the road, so to speak.
You could say that. And all that accumulative debt, well, it eventually becomes a problem.
Because it becomes unsustainable. Like we reach a point where we just can't keep borrowing and spending at the same rate.
Exactly. And that's when we enter the territory of deleveraging.
Oh, deleveraging. That sounds ominous.
Well, it can be. It's basically the process of dealing with that mountain of debt. And trust me, it's not always a pretty sight.
I bet. But we'll have to save that discussion for part 2 because we are out of time for today.
Okay, so we left off talking about deleveraging, basically how an economy deals with a mountain of debt. It's kind of like what happens after that party's over and you're left with the cleanup, right?
Yeah, not the most fun part of the economic cycle. So how does an economy actually get out from under all that debt?
Well, it's not as simple as waving a magic wand and making it disappear. It's a process. Think of it more like figuring out how to pay off a big credit card bill. You have a few different options, right?
Right. You could cut back on spending, maybe pick up an extra side hustle, try to negotiate a lower interest rate, or maybe even borrow more money to pay off the old debt.
You're getting it. Those are actually pretty close to the four main ways an economy can deleverage or reduce its debt burden.
4 ways, huh? What are they?
The first one is spending cuts. Governments and businesses tightening their belts, trying to reduce expenses.
That makes sense. If you're in debt, you got to cut back, right?
In theory, yes, but it's not always that straightforward. Sometimes, if everyone cuts back at the same time, it can actually make things worse.
How so?
Well, imagine if everyone suddenly stops spending money. What happens to businesses?
They start to suffer.
Exactly. They lose customers, they have to lay off workers, and those workers then have less money to spend themselves.
Oh, I see. So it's like a ripple effect. Spending cuts can actually lead to lower incomes, which then makes it even harder for people to pay off their debts.
Precisely. It's a delicate balancing act. The second way an economy can deleverage is through debt reduction.
Debt reduction. Does that mean like just defaulting on loans?
It can, yes. Sometimes borrowers just can't repay what they owe, so we see defaults, bankruptcies, companies going under.
That sounds kind of messy.
It can be. It's like admitting that the debt has become unmanageable, so you got to hit the reset button somehow. But of course, that has consequences too.
I bet. It probably makes lenders a lot more cautious, which can make it harder for businesses and individuals to get the loans they need.
Right. It can really shake confidence in the whole system.
Yeah.
Now, the third way to deleverage is a bit more controversial. It's wealth redistribution.
Redistribution, like taxing the rich and giving to the poor.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. But the basic idea is that the government tries to even things out a bit.
To try and ease the burden on those who are struggling the most.
Yes, exactly. It's all about trying to create a fairer system.
But I imagine that's not always a popular solution, politically speaking.
You're right. It's a touchy subject. There are strong arguments on both sides. Okay, ready for the fourth way to deleverage?
Hit me with it.
This one is probably the most controversial of all. Printing money.
Wait, printing more money? Doesn't that just lead to inflation? Like if there's more money floating around, it just makes everything more expensive?
You're not wrong. Printing too much money can definitely lead to inflation, but sometimes, especially in a crisis, it can be a necessary evil.
How so?
Well, it can be a way to try and stimulate spending to get the economy moving again. It's like, I don't know, jump-starting a car that's stalled out, but you got to be careful not to flood the engine.
Okay, so we've got these 4 levers for deleveraging. Austerity, debt reduction, wealth redistribution, and money printing. Each one has its own pluses and minuses. But how do we know which lever to pull and when?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It depends on a lot of factors. The specific circumstances of the economy, the political climate. There's no easy answer.
So there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
No. And that's what makes economics so fascinating. It's like a puzzle where the pieces are constantly shifting. But sometimes when policymakers get it right, when they manage to pull the right levers in the right combination, we get what Dalio calls a beautiful deleveraging.
Beautiful deleveraging. That sounds almost poetic. What makes it so beautiful?
Well, it's when things don't completely fall apart. It's when you find that sweet spot where the pain is minimized and the economy can start to recover without too much damage. But we'll need to dive into the specifics of that in part 3. Okay, so beautiful deleveraging. It's kind of like imagine you're trying to land a plane in a storm.
Oh boy, that sounds stressful.
It can be, but if you do it right, if you make the right adjustments, you can touch down smoothly, maybe with a little bump here and there, but everyone gets off safe and sound.
Okay, so beautiful deleveraging is like a smooth landing for the economy. So how do we make that happen? How do we pull these 4 levers, spending cuts, debt reduction, wealth redistribution, and money printing, in a way that minimizes the damage?
It's all about balance. You don't want to yank on one lever too hard or ignore another completely. It's about finding that sweet spot where they all work together.
I see. So a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but all carefully coordinated.
Exactly. And that's where good leadership comes in. You need policymakers who understand the economy, who can see the big picture, and who are willing to make tough decisions. Because let's be honest, sometimes those decisions aren't going to be popular.
Right, like with spending cuts. Nobody likes to hear about budget cuts, but sometimes they're necessary.
They can be, yes. But you have to be smart about it. If you just slash spending across the board, it can backfire. you might end up hurting the very people you're trying to help.
Because if people lose their jobs, they have less money to spend, and that hurts the economy even more.
Exactly. It's all connected. So you got to be strategic. Maybe cut spending in some areas, but invest in others. Like investing in education or infrastructure can actually help boost the economy in the long run.
Right, it's like planting seeds for future growth.
Mm.
So it's not just about cutting back, it's also about investing wisely.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Dalio's 3 rules for avoiding debt traps.
Ah, yes, those rules. Remind us what they are again.
Don't let debt grow faster than income. Don't let income grow faster than productivity. And do everything you can to raise productivity.
Okay, those rules make sense, but they also sound like a tall order.
They are. But they're essential. If you want to avoid those painful deleveraging scenarios, you got to keep those rules in mind.
It's like a recipe for a healthy economy.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can follow those rules and manage those 4 levers effectively, we can achieve that beautiful deleveraging.
That's the goal. It's not always easy, but it's definitely possible. And the benefits are huge. A beautiful deleveraging means a smoother ride for everyone.
And less stress when landing that economic plane in a storm.
Exactly. You know, a lot of people think economics is boring, but I actually think it's fascinating. It's all about understanding how the world works, how people make decisions, and how those decisions impact all of us.
Well, I got to say, you've definitely made it more interesting for me, and hopefully for our listeners as well. So there I have it, folks. A deep dive into the economic machine, from those tiny little transactions to those big, scary debt cycles. We've learned about the 4 levers of deleveraging and how finding the right balance can lead us to that elusive but beautiful deleveraging scenario. Remember Dalio's 3 rules and do what you can to understand this fascinating machine that impacts all of our lives. Thanks for tuning in.